Today's event there'll be about a 25-minute talk by a guest speaker, and then he and the correspondent will have a discussion and then open it up to questions thereafter. Our moderator today is Marianne Ori, who's editor of Eurasia Magazine, or deputy editor, but editor of Eurasia Magazine, and Stephen Naj, who's a professor at the International Christian University in Tokyo, Japan, and Hungarian ancestry apparently too, I've just discovered. So I should also say, just as context to this, the Danube Institute has been around about 10, 12 years, and its focus has typically been speaking to the Atlantic world and looking west, but increasingly we're very interested in what's happening to the east, in no small part because you can't really separate the two. And so this is a good example of us looking at the east in the context of the geopolitics that affect the west. So if I can hand it over to Professor Naj. Thank you. Take it away.
Southeast Asia, over the past 20 years, the relationship has gone from about maybe 300 billion US in trade annually to over $1 trillion. So these are significant trading relationships. And as a result, these talks about decoupling and siding with US and China is just quite irrelevant in the region. They don't have a choice but to work with both partners. And I guess that's the take-home message that I want to touch upon today. So choosing sides, Southeast Asian amongst these two countries. And I want to bring in a couple of the key ideas that I think are shaping the region. And we call them regionalization projects, the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative. Don't mix this up with a bad restaurant experience, which is sometimes what we can have with Chinese food in Budapest. We had one the other day. And the free and open Indo-Pacific vision or strategy or plan that's come out of Japan. Both are important, and they're shaping the region, but differently. So I want to touch upon those. Let's see. So the talk is based on this book that I've just written with my co-editor, Indu Saxena. And again, we're trying to look at the Indo-Pacific from Southeast Asian countries. And the reason is because, again, they don't have a choice but to balance these two relationships. So first, I think it's important to put into context the Indo-Pacific. And you may be wondering, what is this region? Why is it so important? Well, first of all, think about where the GDP of the global economy will be by 2050. More than 50% of the global economy will be based in the Indo-Pacific. And that's a huge amount. And that's a big shift from today, big shift from 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And that gives us a kind of sense of why it's important. This is where the middle classes are going to emerge. This is where consumption is going to emerge. This is where many, many, many issues are going to emerge from. Population-wise, 65%. So we have the first, second, and third largest countries on the planet will be India, China, and Indonesia in that order. Southeast Asia, or the Association of Southeast Asian Countries, has about 600 million people. So the same population as Europe. This is significant, and this means that it's going to shape economy, trade, sea lines of communication, and many, many other issues. Again, we're thinking about almost $30 trillion of trade is just within the region. That's a lot, okay? Currently, the EU's GDP, I think, is about $12 or $13 trillion. So it's already more than the EU, meaning that this region will be shaping the future. And that's why we need to be on it. I think it's also important, you can see that there's major alliances within the region, but there's major troubled spots. And I'm going to try to break this down into what we call traditional security issues. There's a lot of territorial disputes between the Southeast Asian countries and China. There's territorial disputes with Japan and China, South Korea and Japan, and many others. And you may be saying, well, this is far away from Hungary. Why does it matter? Let me give you some context. About 5.5 trillion US dollars of trade goes through the South China Sea every year. That's a lot. That's about a third of the EU's total GDP per year. If there's a conflict across the Taiwan Straits, by some estimates, it would cost the global GDP between 8% to 10% of global GDP, so $10 to $15 trillion. Those semiconductors that go into your phones that you're playing on, or your computers that you're taking notes on, they all come from that region, particularly from Taiwan. If there is a conflict in the sea lines of communication in the region, your phones will triple in cost to get a new one. You won't get a new car because the chips won't be delivered here. And those x-rays and MRIs that you love to have when you have a sore back or hips, well, you know what? You probably won't be getting them because there's no chips. So I'm trying to emphasize that this region matters. Hungary may only have 10 million people, but what happens in this region really matters for the global economy. And this is why I think that we need to have our eyes on the region. We need to be thinking about what happens in the region. And we need to have a very good sense of how different countries are managing it. So what are some of my take-homes? And I'd prefer to start with my take-homes and end with a few other facts. But this region is very heterogeneous. Never mix up Malaysia for the Philippines or Vietnam or Singapore or Brunei. They all have great food, but they have different political systems, different cultural and ethnic backgrounds, religions, and views about the major players in the region. Heterogeneity is something you should really understand, and that this heterogeneity is not going away. It's actually, I think, becoming more pronounced as countries develop, and they invest their resources in developing stronger national identities. So if you want to engage in this region, you need to understand it's very heterogeneous. Second is reading the ASEAN tea leaves, so fortune telling. I think too often we listen to ASEAN leaders' statements, and I'm going to show you some, and they say that we don't want to choose between China and the United States. I think this is partly true. But when we have anonymous surveys, what we see is some certain trends, and I'm going to point out some of these. That it's not so cut and dry as they don't want to choose. Rather, they want to be selective in how they side or lean towards the United States or China in terms of different needs and different interests. So we call this multiple alignment here, and I think this is another take-home that you should be understanding. Third, that this region is interested in its own strategic autonomy, being able to make its own choices. All right? It doesn't want to be forced into any corner or any strategic side. It wants to maximize its strategic autonomy in a way that meets the interests of the region and each country within the region. So this is, I think, important. And again, the last part is if we want to engage in the region, it has to be multi-level. So we have to do it through ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. We also need to have mini-lateral approaches, and this has become something that is really gathering momentum in the region. Different formulas of cooperation that are focused on the region, and they're focused on functional cooperation, and they're focused on a specific activity. So, what you might be saying, what is this? A good example is the Philippines working with Canada, and I think this is going to expand to the Vietnamese and Indonesians, on illegal, unregulated, and undocumented fishing. It doesn't sound like much in a country like Hungary, where raw fish isn't exactly the main meal, but for this region, it's really important because undocumented, illegal, and unregulated fishing is really challenging the major protein source of the region. So this is an example of a mini-lateral partnership. It's only 3 or 4 countries, but it's a good example of the kind of engagement that we need to engage in the region. And of course, bilateral relations, so building strong bilateral relations with each of the countries. So as I said, reading the tea leaves is really important, and there's a great resource that you might want to take a look at. And it comes from Singapore's Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, and they have an annual survey called the Survey of Southeast Asia. So I think my Malaysian colleague must have read this. I hope she did. But this is really an excellent survey because it surveys 4,000 policymakers, but anonymously. And that means they speak a little bit more truth to what they're thinking. And when we look at this, it's not so cut and dry. You can see how confident are you in China will do the right thing to contribute to global peace, security, prosperity, and governance. And you can see that it changes year by year. And I assume this year it will change with the new president in the United States. I assume that the United States position will drop. But you can see that, for example, the Philippines, they're relatively more confident, let's say, than Malaysia or Laos. We see Cambodia is quite favorable. No confidence. You can see ASEAN as a whole is not that confident. But within ASEAN, there's a lot of variety. And that goes to the point. It's very heterogeneous. Don't treat the region as a region. Make sure you understand that they have some internal heterogeneity in terms of how they view these two big partners. And if we pivot over to the China side, it's the same thing. You know, ASEAN as a whole, in 2023, 6.5% have no confidence. In 2023, 18.1% have confidence. Myanmar is very positive. Vietnam, not so positive. Again, this illustrates that the region is not homogeneous. Rather, it's very heterogeneous. And I think that's an important way to be thinking about engagement in the region. You know, as I mentioned, the leaders talk about they don't want to choose, but the behavior is a little bit different. And again, drilling down into how policymakers think, I think that they still want to have a beneficial relationship with China in terms of economy. It's absolutely essential for the development of this region. But at the same time, they look to Japan and they look to the EU as trusted partners. This doesn't mean that you're always a trusted partner. EU has to work hard to keep this relationship. Japan needs to continue to work hard to keep this position. But this means that, again, Southeast Asian countries are not just thinking about China and the US. They're thinking about building other extra-regional partners to help build their strategic autonomy. I think, again, we can look at other sources of information, such as the Lowy Institute's Asia Power Index. Great tool. I can't encourage you to look at it enough. But again, it shows that China has a lot more economic connections within the region, and those economic connections give it influence in the way that, for example, the United States doesn't have. But if you compare it to Japan and others, Japan does okay. Japan's actually the biggest foreign direct investor in Southeast Asia, followed by China. And who's number 3? Does anybody know? Taiwan. Taiwan's a very big investor in the region. And this is one of the big concerns about a Taiwan-China clash. You won't just lose the China investor. You're going to lose the Taiwan investor and probably the Japanese investor, and that's it for Southeast Asia. So again, we need to be thinking about this region, how interconnected it is. Some other important aspects is the United States is not absent from the region. The United States is a major power in the region. And it certainly isn't just a military power. And I think that this is often a mistake when we look at United States engagement in the region. We often just think it's about ships and missiles and military power, but in fact it's a major investor. And that investment is long-term, and it continues to deepen despite different changes in administration in the United States. So I guess the key questions that I want to ask or touch upon with all of you really is, how does Southeast Asia manage this difficult challenge of its biggest economic partner, China, challenging the region and trying to create a cohesive rules-based order? And you may be saying, rules-based order, what does that mean? Well, if you don't share the same rules, how do you trade? How do you deal with piracy? How do you deal with disinformation? How do you deal with illegal activities? And every single country in the region, they may not agree to the same law, but they want to agree to the same norm. And this is a bit of a nuance, but in such a heterogeneous region, you're not going to have shared law. You may have shared agreed upon behavior. And this is an ASEAN concept that I think is really strong, that we should continue to look at, that we want to move towards shared behavior. We don't necessarily need to have a law saying that we all have to do this. The second question is how do Southeast Asian countries balance their economic interests and their security? And here I want to bring in two key concepts or frameworks, the BRI and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific. so that you get a sense that these countries are trying to maximize their agency, which means they're trying to do things on their own. They don't want to just be pushed around by the two big players. They're trying to find ways to solve their own problems. So I think that's an important issue. And again, when I reflect upon Central European countries and Hungary, I think there's similar lessons to be learned. You don't necessarily have to be passive. You can be proactive. And the last question, can we balance these actions using something called hedging? And I think this is a term that you may find a bit alien, but I'm going to introduce it to you anyways. So hedging, and there's a great Malaysian scholar, KK Quick, so I'm sure our Malaysian diplomat has met Mr. Quick, great friend. But he talks about hedging in terms of this idea of 4 or 6 ways of engaging with other countries. And because Southeast Asian countries by themselves are so small, the second one, dominance denial, or trying to build up military power to resist, let's say, US or China, or those awful Canadians that could come with their canoes, it's not going to happen. They just don't have the resources. So I think we can skip this one, but binding engagement is something that our Southeast Asian friends are doing. That means trying to anchor different countries in different kinds of regional schemes, such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or different kinds of environmental cooperations, or something called the ASEAN Way, or ASEAN Centrality, where we agree upon things through something called consensus-based decision-making, where we all agree to do something or nothing happens. Another one is return maximization, and that means working with everybody and get the most that you can from relationships. Very important, and Southeast Asian countries are very adept at working with all the players, including China and Southeast and United States. And indirect balancing, and again, this is coalition building and working within institutions, but just short of formal alliances. Southeast Asian countries are worried about their security. They should be, but they're not willing to build an alliance. They're willing to work within different frameworks to try and balance some of the pressures that are coming from bigger powers in the region. So these key concepts, again, indirect balancing, return maximization, and binding hedging, are behavior that we call hedging. And I think they're very useful terms for us to better understand how Southeast Asian countries are managing the US and China. So FOIP and BRI is hedging strategies. So I think you don't have to choose between these. You actually use both of them. So the Belt Road Initiative, for some of you, you may know or may not know, but it's basically land corridors of infrastructure, roads and bridges, tunnels, and a sea corridor, which is usually ports. Now, for China, this comes from its developmental experience, where it opened up its rural areas to moving to the East Coast and to manufacturing centers. And this is how, and then it built cheap stuff that we all use for global export. And that capital came back to the workers, and the workers brought that money back to their home countries, or to their home counties and villages. So that is the model. And China learned this originally from the Japanese. And they are exporting this through the BRI. And we see, again, some Chinese scholars that I've interviewed talk about this in terms of new developmentalism. So this is how we develop in the region. We unleash the cheap capital that comes from our excessive populations. We use them to build things cheaply and export them globally. That's what's happened. Other scholars talking about geoeconomics, again, this competition and building dependencies between China and other countries. Others talk about an economic autonomy, pivoting away from the East Coast and moving China's economic center towards South Central Asia and South Asia and Southeast Asia. And again, if you know a little bit about Chinese history, China was invaded by imperial powers, not on land, except for the Mongolians, but it was from the sea. The European powers came from the sea. The Japanese came from the sea. So they're hyper security focused on their eastern border and the South China Sea. Security, again, thinking about what would happen if there was a conflict, again, between those horrible Canadians that will come with their canoes and block off the Malacca Straits. I'm trying to de-Americanize this, just so that's why I use this analogy. But what would happen if that was the case? And from the Chinese economy standpoint, the economy would shut down. So many scholars believe that China's investment in the BRI is very much about its own security. And then lastly, a grand strategy to kind of dominate the region. So I don't think to understand the BRI, you have to choose between these. Chinese scholars themselves say it's all of the above. Easy multiple choice test. The free and open Indo-Pacific is a little bit different. It's different because it focuses on the maritime lanes, the sea lines of communication. A code word for that is SLOC. And again, if you think about this area, that is where all of Europe's energy comes from. That's where its imports and exports come from. And if there's a disruption in the sea lines of communication in this area, it's going to be deeply devastating to your economies. And I think that's a really important difference when we think about the free and open Indo-Pacific. It is primarily a maritime framing of the region and how we should focus on building shared norms about how to behave in the sea lines of communication so that we have stability. No trade, no stable sea lines of communication. The major economies of the global economy will break down. And as a result, there's a large focus on, again, free and open. And they use these words as well to talk about the importance of transparency and rule of law. If we let big countries do what they want in the sea lines of communication, they're likely going to dominate the sea lines of communication in ways that preference their national interests and probably not ours. Smaller countries like Canada or Malaysia or Singapore or Hungary. So there's a bit of a difference. It also focuses on development. I'm not going to go through this. I don't think it's so important for today's discussion. But its key pillars are, again, inclusivity, trying to include as many countries as possible, infrastructure and connectivity, focus on trade, this idea of a rules-based order, and this includes digital, maritime space, and trade, and again, highlighting maritime security as a really, really important part of the free and open Indo-Pacific. So both of these initiatives are interesting. And we can look at them comparatively. I think when we look at the FOIP understanding, really it's about U.S. leadership, and this is under question now. We don't know where the U.S. is going today. And this is why I think countries like Australia and Japan will be more and more important in trying to stabilize this system. But they do talk about an inclusive order that's based on rule of law. It's based on good governance, high standards, fiscal sustainability, environmental standards, transparency, good governance, etc. The problem is it's smaller scale, there's not as much money behind it, and it's rules-based. And remember one of those key points I mentioned at the start of today's lecture about heterogeneity and how Southeast Asia is not exactly, they're not exactly democratic rule-based societies. They have different levels of development, they have different national priorities, and they have different national interests. And this is a challenge for them to adopt some of the free and open Indo-Pacific ideas if they're based on rule of law. The BRI, on the other hand, is really China's attempt to try and create a new model of relations. And that new model is based on non-intervention to its core interests. And we can talk a little bit more about this. But I think it's been structured in a way based on China's historical past, where imperial powers interfered in Chinese politics and really tried to break up China as we know it today. It's non-interventionist. That means that they don't want to interfere in other countries and they don't want you to interfere in China. And that makes sense. Again, I think there's a strong component about creating economic reliance on China. And if you listen to Secretary General Xi Jinping at the 20th Party Congress in October 2022, he talked about this in his Worker Party's report. He said, we want to create dependencies. We want the surrounding countries to be more dependent on us than us dependent on them. And that gives them more leverage. And lastly, standards set by Beijing. So both of these are interesting and they provide opportunities for Southeast Asian countries to build their autonomy. I think, and the countries are looking to both of these as hedging strategies. Remember, return maximization If you're a developing country, you want to get everything you can on the table to build your economies, to help build a middle class and make sure it's sustainable. You want that infrastructure. You want to be connected to the global economy. And as a result, they're not choosing between any of these. They're actually engaging in both. And I think that's an important lesson for us to be thinking about. They're doing this through different kinds of opportunities, so different kinds of infrastructure projects. I'll show you one, or a couple. So these are some through, let's do the Chinese, So this is the China-based one. So it stretches from Yunnan province all the way through Vietnam and stretching to Thailand and Myanmar. So this is a good example of the kind of infrastructure project that's going on. The Japanese have invested in an east-west economic corridor from Vietnam to Myanmar, a southern corridor, so you can see the gray line connecting Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and Myanmar, and the red line, which connects China down to Singapore. So these are examples of infrastructure that builds more interconnectivity, and the idea is that the more integrated the region is, that it will trade more with itself, and that means it's going to trade less with other big partners. And that gives it more strategic autonomy. Make sense? On security, again, the Southeast Asian states have no possibility to engage in dominance denial, but they certainly are engaging in different kinds of cooperation with Japan or the United States or Australia or even Canada, as I mentioned, with the illegal, unregulated, undocumented cooperation. And this is a reality because siding with the U.S. is not a positive for Malaysia or Singapore or Vietnam. Leaning towards the United States, maybe. And I'm going to give you an example of that. So what we see is Southeast Asian countries welcoming many security partnerships, and they're not choosing between, let's say, China and the U.S. They're actually bringing in outside partners like Japan, which is interesting. So you may be saying, "Oh, Stephen, what are you talking about? Not choosing?" And I go, or choosing. And I go, Vietnam's a great example. Before they welcomed Secretary General Xi Jinping to Hanoi in January 2024, they welcomed Mr. Biden, the Vice President. They set up a Center of Disease Control during the pandemic. They strengthened relations with Japan. They signed a free trade agreement with Europe. They joined the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. They joined the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. They strengthened their strategic partnership with Japan. And then they said, Xi Jinping, come down to Hanoi, have a nice bowl of pho, and we're going to sign a BRI agreement. So when I think about this, the Vietnamese are quite smart. They said we're going to engage as much as we can with other countries before we welcome our complex partner to the north. And I said that, a complex partner to the north, very explicitly, because they have a similar political system, shared history, but they have some complicated relations in terms of how they interpret their history, as well as they have territorial disputes. So from Vietnam's perspective, China is not an enemy, but it's a complicated partner. And I encourage you to think about the region in that way, not enemies and allies, but rather complicated neighbors. It's just like brothers and sisters in many ways. We have many complicated brothers and sisters, I'm sure, in this room as well. So we see these countries using both of these initiatives to try and seize their strategic interests. And they're benefiting. Rather than competition, they want to project sustainability and protect their national interests. Rather than choosing sides, they want to manage debt vulnerabilities. And they do this, again, through a multi-alignment diplomatic approach. And you might be going, what is multi-alignment? Well, basically, on some issues you align with China, on some issues you align with the US, on some issues you align with neither. Multiple alignment, okay? So we see them they continue to prioritize their strategic autonomy. They use multi-alignment, and they try to leverage the BRI and FOIP and any other initiative that they can get their hands on to try and maximize their strategic autonomy. They're also trying to ensure that ASEAN centrality remains a pillar of these other initiatives. And yes, they are becoming a pillar of other initiatives. So if you go to the US's Free and Open Indo-Pacific, so Louis is from the US, ASEAN centrality is part of your Indo-Pacific strategy. The Japanese plan, ASEAN centrality is part of the plan. The Canadian one, yes, Canada too, ASEAN centrality is part of their Indo-Pacific strategy. So they are engaging what we call binding engagement, right? Saying, the ASEAN countries are saying, we're not going to play with you unless you adopt our approach to diplomacy. It's interesting, it's difficult, but that's how the system is working. Last, a few points again, as we think about how Southeast Asia is managing these relationships. We see there's 7 broad strategies. Again, as they want to focus on strategic autonomy. How can we maximize the choices that we have? And I think every country would like to do this, but smaller countries have more challenges, especially when they're wedged between big countries. They're employing multiple alignment and engagement. They're not saying no to anybody. They're aligning with China on some things and aligning with the US or Japan or the EU on other things. Multiple alignment is how they're working, and I think this is a real trend in international politics that you should keep your eyes on, especially in the Indo-Pacific, because it's so heterogeneous. Practicing diplomatic flexibility and pragmatism. No reason to choose. Always focus on dialogue and cooperation. Finding ways to continue that dialogue. And ASEAN itself has been in dialogue for 50 years. They sometimes call it the funny shirt club because you have to wear the shirt of the hosting country every year. So Malaysia, it's this year, right? So watch for the Malaysian clothes. But the point is that these leaders have come and talked for 50 years. They know each other. They know each other's quirks. They know how they work. And they know how to work with them in ways that are non-binding and focus on moving forward. And that's an interesting approach to be thinking about squeezing between that narrow window of US-China strategic competition. They emphasize constructive engagement and dialogue. And this is becoming more difficult. Myanmar has presented real challenges. There's real challenges to ASEAN centrality right now. And I will be frank about that. Some countries are influenced by outside powers more than others. But they're always employing a hedging and risk management strategy. They can't afford to have conflict in the region. And for Southeast Asian countries, issues such as the 1997 Asian financial crisis, it was a terrible financial crisis that put back 200 million Asians into poverty. And they know what instability can bring to the region. And as a result, they want to prioritize stability and prioritize engagement. They promote regional cooperation and solidarity, and that continues to be the case, even if it's small things. And lastly, and I think importantly, is they protect their national interests and sovereignty. And this is, I think, a challenge. ASEAN is a challenge to sovereignty, but it also protects sovereignty. They work together to protect their strategic autonomy and their interests. And they understand that in the long term, it's better to work together and stick together than to move off on their own. And you might be saying, Professor Nagy, what about the Philippines? The Philippines is not representative of ASEAN. I'm sorry. They are moving very differently. If they're successful, wow, this will be maybe a model for other ASEAN countries. If they're a failure, other ASEAN countries will say, you should have stuck to the plan. So don't use the Philippines as, I think, a barometer or a litmus test of where ASEAN is going. Look to countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Singapore, who are always balancing, using hedging strategies, their interests with US and China. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very insightful lecture. And first of all, I would like to ask you about a rather hot topic, I think, for Southeast Asia, which you have also touched upon briefly. What is your opinion about which direction may the United States take with Donald Trump as president in connection with Southeast Asia? Is it totally unpredictable, or do you see some logic here?
So I think I did a miracle in my presentation. Like a virgin birth, I didn't talk about Mr. Trump. But thank you for ruining my record. So I think it's really useful for us to step away from the daily news and noise that is associated with the current president of the United States and focus on the United States' long-term changes. And I think if we pivot back to George Bush Jr., we already saw the contours of U.S. foreign policy emerging back then. George Bush Jr. Re-engaged India, provided nuclear technologies to India, thinking about India as an important player in balancing and creating a multipolar Indo-Pacific region in the future. President Obama doubled down on this with the pivot, and you may be saying, oh, the pivot fizzled. Not really. The U.S. procured equipment, defense equipment for the region. It upped its diplomatic engagement in the region. And then, of course, Trump 1.0 continued this. He doubled down on many of the fundamentals. He changed how it looked, took credit for everything, but that doesn't matter. I think the general direction was the same. One of the fundamental changes, I guess, was a more outwardly aggressive approach to China and calling China out. The Biden administration continued this, became more sequential, systematic, and allies first. And it's a little bit too early to tell with Trump 2.0, but on the day he was inaugurated, the Quad countries met. They met and they talked about strengthening their partnership. Mr. Modi has been back, and they talked about strengthening their partnership. The AUKUS agreement has been talked about in terms of we got to move forward with the AUKUS agreement, and likely the next Vice Secretary of Defense, Albert Colby, talked about the importance of AUKUS. And I guess my short point is that we've seen much more continuity in terms of the investments of the administrations, with the long-term view that the biggest economic competitor and strategic competitor for the U.S., and I think probably a large part of the world, is China. But it's not necessarily a zero-sum game. And I think that's an important take-home as well. The U.S. would like to have a cooperative relationship with China. It must have a cooperative relationship with China. If we're going to deal with many problems in the world today, it has to be a cooperative relationship. But it first comes from a position of strength. And I think there's much more continuity.
If we are looking at the EU and the EU's relations with Southeast Asia, do you think that the EU is seen as a relevant player from the region, or is not as important as we think? And what I'm referring to is that here in Europe, we like to think about ourselves as the center of the world, so that everyone is looking at what is happening here. But is Southeast Asia really interested in Europe, either in politics or in trade or economy?
So I think Europe has a lot of positive contributions to Southeast Asia. You know, the fact that some of the countries used to be colonial powers, of course, is a big negative. But it also gives them insight in terms of what are the regional dynamics, the regional politics, how they've changed over the decades. So I think in some ways Europe, or some European countries, have a literacy about Southeast Asia that is probably it's much deeper than, let's say, where I'm from, Canada, or where we are in Hungary today. So I think European countries should delicately use that experience to engage in some of the former colonies in sensitive ways. And I'm trying to understand or express that, you know, there is still concern about European countries in the region. But that being said, Europe has lots to offer. Trade partner, and I mentioned Vietnam has signed a trade agreement with the EU. That's something that I think other other ASEAN countries may want to think about. I think EU has a big place in development and promoting good governance, which I think is really important. I think that the EU also has an important role in negotiating and providing a venue that perhaps can train legal scholars and other scholars in Southeast Asia to deal with some of the challenges they face. So I think there's a lot there. It's about creatively building those partnerships. And I think Southeast Asian countries welcome that. I'm going to give you an example on some of the Track 1.5 events that I attend. I'm surprised to hear, the UK and the French and the Dutch are actually training Southeast Asian lawyers on the law of the sea so they can better manage the challenges that they're facing in the South China Sea. So we don't have to necessarily do big things. I think it's important to think about how we can add to human capital and how we can improve the conditions for Southeast Asian countries to deal with the challenges they face on their own.
When Southeast Asian countries are looking at Europe, what is more important for them? The European institutions, so the EU as a whole, or are they more interested in individual countries like in Germany or France?
So both. So we should never make the mistake that the EU is the roadmap for how ASEAN is going to evolve. That is a big mistake. The EU is much more homogeneous than ASEAN. ASEAN wants to develop its own way forward. I think it's chosen the ASEAN centrality as kind of the core way to do that. And 50 years, it's working pretty good. Of course, there's challenges, but the EU is not without challenges. So I think that working with the EU is something they can do. EU collectively has an economic weight, a geopolitical weight, and that is important to consider. But also looking at different countries. What does different countries offer to Southeast Asian countries? So again, I think Germany may offer something on the economy and good governance. Maybe the vis-a-vis Grad 4 countries may offer something on cooperation and minilateral partnerships. This is an area that our Malaysian and Singaporean diplomats may have something to talk about afterwards. But, ASEAN's not working well, and there's at least 3 or 4 countries that are not necessarily always cooperative. Maybe there is room for ASEAN minus, and Singaporean diplomats do talk about this. So ASEAN, or vis-a-vis Grad 4 may be a model to think about, or how can we work in smaller units. And then there's those countries that are again finding ways to work with China and finding ways to work with the United States. So there's a lot of different relationships and things that I think Southeast Asia and Europe can exchange with each other. But it does you must be literate about both regions and understand the nuances of both regions to create those kinds of platforms.
The way you have described how the ASEAN countries are navigating between the great powers, this approach is rather close to Hungary's strategy of connectivity. Is that we are against block building, and because our interest is to maintain good relations with all the great powers. What can Hungary, or in general our region, Central Eastern Europe, learn from the ASEAN countries?
So, Hungary, 80% of its trade is with the EU. So that means that it needs to navigate this relationship in a diplomatic way and in the most constructive way. Because, that's where most of its trade is. The last 20% is a bonus. So with the trade with the US or trade with North America or trade with Japan, trade with China, anything positive is a plus. But ASEAN is different. ASEAN has, of course, a very big trading relationship with China, but also a very big trading relationship and a very positive relationship with Japan. It also has a trade relationship with the EU. So I think the balance is a little bit different, and this gives Southeast Asian countries a little bit more maneuvering room than Hungary. And, of course, its size means it has more choice. So as I think about what Hungary can learn from this region, I think working with regional partners and building strong regional partnerships in Europe is probably a good start. And then also connecting to other regions that can add value and stabilize and give you more strategic autonomy within your key partnership. At least that's what I would put on paper. I think, again, Hungary's biggest interest is in the EU, and that must be the priority partner. I'll let you decide if that's where Hungary is right now. In my observation, it's still finding different ways to balance all these relationships in a way that helps Hungarians.
Well, this year is the 17th anniversary of the Bandung Conference, which was in Indonesia in 1955, and that was the foundation of the later non-aligned movement. So we can say that the non-aligned movement was basically its foundation was in Southeast Asia. Do you think that the region still sees itself as an integral part of the global South in general? Does it want to lead the non-aligned countries, or is it rather involved in its own issues?
Yeah, I think it's rather like most regions. It's quite parochial. It looks at the regional issues rather than big priorities. But I think from Southeast Asian countries' point of view, and it's one of the first points on my slide, take-homes, heterogeneity, it's not unified. So let's look at the war in the Ukraine war. Vietnam is still very dependent on Russian arms and Russian energy. So its position, and it has a strong relationship with Russia. It doesn't like the war, but it thought about its national interests and how it should engage, and it took a non-aligned position based on that. Singapore, small nation state, absolutely depends on rules. So its position was different than Vietnam. Malaysia, different. I think Malaysia looks at some of the hypocrisy of the attention on the Ukraine-Russian war and has a different interpretation. So I think, again, we can't look at the region as a unit. We have to look at it country by country to see how they're viewing these issues. And it's not static. The October 7th terrorist attack on Israel then changed how Indonesia, Malaysia is looking at these issues as well. So I think it's a little bit oversimplistic to say that they want to stay non-aligned. I think they want to stay as strategically autonomous as possible, but they can't ignore the issues that are happening outside their borders. Do they want to lead the global South or developing countries? I think that they're a little bit more humble, and they realize that they can't lead the global South, but they may find their ASEAN way may be a model to help the global South move forward and become more influential.
Well, you have mentioned that there are significant differences between how the different countries are acting and how they see their situation in the world. What do you think are the most interesting comparisons or the most striking differences between approaches of the different countries in the region?
That's a good one. So I think the Philippines shifts back and forth depending on its government. So the current president, President Marcos, has really shifted the position of the Philippines and tightened the partnership with the United States. And I said it's an outlier because I think it has a much more aggressive approach, or I don't want to say aggressive, much more defensive approach towards dealing with its issues towards China. And it's actively working with Australia, the US, Japan to try and deal with that challenge. So that's one approach. And then I mentioned the Vietnamese approach. They engage with everybody else before they engage with the Chinese. And then there's a Malaysian approach that, they say, well, we want to continue to invest with China. We have big Chinese investors here. This is good for Malaysia. We want to keep that. That's another approach. The Indonesians are fascinating, so they'll do some joint exercises with the Chinese small exercises, and then 1 month later, they'll do much larger exercises with the Australians and the Americans. So we see this kind of schizophrenic approach to dealing with issues. And if I read them collectively, I think that on the security side, they lean towards the US. On the economic side, they lean towards China. And I think that's about right. And I use the word lean as opposed to ally because the Southeast Asian countries can't ally with anybody. They need to focus on maintaining that cohesion of the ASEAN grouping so that they have collective weight or a collective voice against much bigger powers.
It's an interesting, fact about the Western thought bubble where we are in is that even though, for example, Indonesia is already the fourth biggest country in the world, and in a few decades it will be the fourth biggest economy, it's predicted to be, we don't really know too much about that country and in general about the region, apart from being a holiday destination basically for many people. As the economic relevance of these countries will grow, do you think that this will change and they will play a bigger role in world politics in general?
So, growth is not linear. And I'm a bit older than some of you here, and there's a few people older than me. But I'm sure there's a few people that remember in the 1980s the fears about Japan taking over the world. Not Pax America, but Pax Nipponica. And there was a lot of books written about this. And then 2000s, 2015, a lot of books about China taking over the world. Now, not so many. I think most of the data suggests that China will never overtake the US economy. And now we're seeing a growing number of books emerging out of India, that India will, it's called Vishnaguru Bharat, the Indian teachings will create new peace and stability and economic energy. And I use that because I think the evidence suggests that ASEAN will become more important, but I think it will become more fragile. The Philippines has too many young people and not enough good jobs. That means incomes stay low. Incomes stay low means you don't build capital to really build the kind of future you need for your kids. Thailand's getting old. I know, when you go to the beach, it doesn't look old, but it's getting old. And this means that people are not having kids. Singapore's not having kids. Vietnam's not having kids. Indonesia, they actually went back in terms of their poverty index this year. So the trajectory is not linear. And I guess my worries is that the growth may slow, and if growth slows, the development will slow, of course, and this means they may not escape the middle income trap. And if that is the case, the region may become more fragile and more exposed to extremist ideas and instability. And we see this, we see cracks emerging. And I think this is something that we need to continue to look at. Michael Oslin wrote a good book about this. He's at the Hoover Institute. It's called The End of the Asian Century. I think it's a pretty good picture of the challenges, right? And be careful to make the assumption that growth is not only linear, but permanent. And I think the lesson is that many regions are struggling with low birth rates, not being able to escape the middle income trap, and the fundamentals of the state, that's family, are breaking down, making development not so sustainable in many ways.
What strategies do these countries have to counter these tendencies which you have mentioned, or what would you advise them to do?
Well, I think each country has different values and histories and cultural makeups, so they have to determine what is best for them. I think there's a pretty clear I think it's pretty clear that the political system that you have really doesn't necessarily help you deal with these challenges. So Taiwan is a vibrant democratic society. It has really bad birth rates. China is not exactly democratic. It has very bad birth rates. South Korea is a super vibrant society, democratic, very bad birth rates. The Philippines, very democratic, very democratic, but it has too many kids. So as we think about this, I think some of the key determinants or the key factors behind, I guess, dealing with some of these real serious challenges is good governance, strong economies. I think gender equality continues to play an important part of that. And there's other experts in the room like Ms. Ikeda who can talk about this. But these are the core foundations of sustainable growth, and you have to have sustainable growth to create sustainable families. Immigration isn't the answer. It's part of the answer, but it's not the answer. So I think there's a lot of changes that need to be done that would probably need to be tailored for each society, and I don't think any society is managing this well.
How sustainable do you think the current strategy of the ASEAN countries is, and will these challenges which you have mentioned influence it?
So the Southeast Asian countries don't really have a choice. They have to continue to balance between all the partners, and I think that they have to work together. And it's going to become increasingly difficult with some partners in ASEAN more susceptible to the influence of some regional countries than others. So how do they maintain their cohesion is, I think, the real question. And can they use this cohesion to deal with some of the challenges they're facing? So that's one. Second is whether I think the United States will remain engaged in the region and what will be the nature of that engagement. So I think investment is really important. Diplomatic engagement is really important. Concrete initiatives and cooperation with like-minded partners. That doesn't mean democracies. That means shared same interests. And building infrastructure in the region, building capabilities in the region will be really important. If the U.S. pulls out and creates that vacuum for China to move in, then I think the region will likely tilt towards China, and it will fundamentally, the dynamics of the region will change in short-term ways that is good for the region. Probably long-term ways will erode away the strategic autonomy they've really worked hard for. So I think this is where extra-regional partners like the EU, like Japan, like Canada, like Australia are really important. Bring them in, build strong partnerships, find ways to build minilateral partnerships, find ways to improve governance. And you probably noticed, did I say human rights once? I didn't, did I? Did I say democracy once? I didn't. And I'm Canadian. I value these. Don't get me wrong. But I think we can use a different language. Let's focus on good governance. Let's try to get rid of corruption. This is the language of the region. So use better language to, solve the same problem, but don't be evangelistic about, what you think is good for the region. And I think the region is actually much more receptive to good governance and ideas of development than talking about human rights or democracy, even though I value those. But I think in terms of diplomacy, those extra-regional partners can do a lot more for the region, focusing on those kinds of terminologies rather than, I think, those normative ideas that may not sell so well in such a heterogeneous region.
Well, in connection with the Ukraine war, there are many speculations in Western media and among Western politicians and thinkers is that with Donald Trump, there is a new approach to world politics, and maybe even there are plans to have a new separation of the world to regions or areas of influence. So, like some belong to the United States, or to Russia, others to China. as if they would have a new Yalta conference. Do you think that if this speculation will be true or almost true, will the ASEAN region be allowed to maintain its strategic autonomy, or will it fall into one of the areas of influence?
That's a big question. So where is where is the conflict in Ukraine going? That's the big question. And is the United States going? What is the United States going to do? And does the United States, under the current president, believe that that is a natural sphere of influence for Russia? I think the general reading is yes. I think that's what it believes. But the problem with that paradigm is Europe. Europe has an interest. And I don't think just Europe has an interest. Japan has an interest. Australia has an interest. Singapore has an interest. Canada has an interest. Every single middle-sized country has an interest in ensuring that an aggressor in a conflict doesn't come away not penalized. I think this means that whatever Russia and Russia and the United States decide, it will have to go through a filter of these other countries that also have interests. So that's how I feel that it'll eventually play out, that Europe will have to come to the table. And we already see changes. Europe has just made the agreement for, I think, $150 billion of defense spending over the next 10 years. It's not a lot, but it's a lot more than what it was. And I think this is going to be what will be the final arbiter of where this conflict goes, because Europe has an interest in this not rewarding the aggressor. In Southeast Asia, though, I think the lesson will be similar, is that they, privately, they don't like what's happened. They realize that this is not good if the aggressor comes away with no penalties. So how will they manage this in their diplomacy quietly, and how will they strengthen ASEAN centrality, and how will they bring in other players to maintain their concept of their region? And I think they will continue. I think they'll go to Japan and say, how can we do more? I think they'll go to the EU and say, how can we do more? I think they'll go to India and say, how can we do more? They're already coming to Canada and say, how can we do more? So I think that will be their approach, rather than lean more to the US or lean more to China. Again, it will be to strengthen the foundations of how ASEAN has negotiated great power politics for the past 60 years, 50 years.
One last question before we give the floor to the audience. When we speak about what is the interest and the main approach of the different countries in the region, do you think it is only determined by geopolitics and it is given, or are domestic political considerations also, so do they also play a big part?
Well, foreign policy is basically domestic policy. That's every single country. So Malaysia has a large ethnic Chinese population that has been a big part of their economic development. This is why they have strong ties with China. Actually, the whole region, if you look at the history, from the transition of the Ming Dynasty back in the 14th or 15th century to the Qing Dynasty, there was a huge outflow of at that time Ming aristocrats and thinkers and merchants, and they settled in Bangkok and Manila and Jakarta and Kuala Lumpur. They wouldn't have called them those names back then. They settled there and they built their communities, and they basically are the lattice work of the region's integration. And it's a fascinating discussion for another talk. But they play an important part in the positive engagement towards China. But also they play an important part in the concerns about China. And this is the complexity of the region. We also see different countries have different inclinations to their history. So Vietnam has from the Vietnamese perspective, they won a war with the United States, and they won a war against the French, and they are a strong country, and they can engage with both as equals. Laos and Cambodia are much smaller. They don't have that leverage, and they have a very different relationship with China, and they have very deep challenges in terms of good governance and corruption that shape their engagement. So I think as we think about domestic politics in each region, we have to again look at their history, look at their economic engagement, look at the ethnic balance in each country and how they shape the policies, and again look at how political leaders deploy populism to support ASEAN or to erode away ASEAN. And I think still today, the domestic politics are informing and creating the conditions where each ASEAN leader is saying that it's more important for us to work with ASEAN and strengthen ASEAN centrality to deal with US-China competition than to break away ASEAN or split ASEAN into 6 countries or 8 countries.
Thank you. So it's time for the questions from the audience.
Well, first of all, as the president of the Danube Institute, I'd like to thank Professor Wells for a really illuminating talk and illuminating answers to questions. It's very helpful to us here because when we started 12 years ago, we obviously were concentrating on Central Europe, Europe and the Anglosphere. They were our contacts and we developed them. But in recent years, we've expanded our range of interests and range of contacts more widely. In fact, my colleague, the director who introduced you, has just returned from a trip to India. We've been there several times recently, and we're very keen to receive the kind of helpful analysis and advice that you just gave us. Thank you very much. Having said that, there is one common interest that unites all of those countries, and it also unites them with America, Europe, and the rest of the world, really, which is that they don't want the Taiwan conflict to develop into a serious war. Now, obviously, Xi Jinping cut off one way of solving that problem when he abrogated the agreement with Hong Kong, because, of course, the idea of having a unity of China that didn't necessarily mean the iron control of the Communist Party was the underlying idea behind that. I wonder if, with the rise of the civilizational state, which is something that's been discussed recently, that doesn't open a way for the Chinese to develop a new strategy, which would be to say, encouraging a sinosphere with all of the communities of the Chinese in this part of the world on cultural grounds, which obviously Taiwan would be part of, but it would be a way of increasing the ties between the People's Republic on the one hand and all of the Chinese communities, but particularly with Hong Kong and with Taiwan, and also, of course, with Singapore, which is a part of the Sinosphere too, as well as part of the Anglosphere. So, do you see any hopeful way of developing that kind of approach?
So this is a great question. So the assumption that there's a sinosphere, or there was a sinosphere, assumes that there was one shared culture and one shared language, and one shared spirituality, one shared view. And I think that this is probably problematic. The first migrants to Malaysia or Thailand or Vietnam, they didn't speak Mandarin. They probably spoke a version of Cantonese or Hokkien or Hakka. And if you go to Singapore today, or frankly, you go to Tokyo, Yokohama, you'll see the Hakka Association, the Hokkien Association. So what this suggests is that the past dynastic identities of China were actually multilingual, multi-ethnic, multi-spirituality. So I think the starting point is, if you think that there was a homogeneous Chinese identity, this is probably not historically accurate. So then this leads me to think that, okay, Sinosphere, of course, if you go to Tokyo or you go to Seoul and you go to the Temple of Literature in Hanoi, or you go to parts of Singapore, Malaysia, you will see Chinese influence. I guess, though, is this contemporary Chinese influence or that historic influence that comes from the plurality of Chinese society in the past? And I think it's the latter. To suggest that the values of Singapore Chinese or Malaysian Chinese or Indonesian Chinese or Filipino Chinese are the same as contemporary China, I don't think they would say they have the same values. Actually, I think they would say they fought hard to not be homogenized by the Maoist socialist revolution in the 50s and 60s. So the question is how can we deal with the Taiwan challenge, right? Ultimately, that will be for the Taiwanese and the Chinese to decide. But I think as outsiders, I continue to believe that Taiwan is an international public good, and that by talking about Taiwan as an international public good and avoiding the idea of a one China policy, it allows us to make sure that peace and stability remains intact across the Taiwan Strait, that these two societies can coexist and build communication over the long term and accept each other's different political realities. And I think that is what that's what I continue to write about, that Taiwan is an international public good. What do I mean by that? Again, a conflict across the Taiwan Straits would probably put 7 to 8 to 10% of the global GDP in a bucket. The biggest 3 FDI providers to Southeast Asia and probably India would no longer provide FDI. So that means China's economy would go bust, the Taiwanese economy would go bust, the Southeast Asian economy would go bust, India's economy would go bust. Because India is also a big recipient of Taiwanese FDI. So rather than a sinocentric sphere, I think that we should continue to talk about Taiwan in terms of an international public good. And I'm sure my Taiwanese friends will say, that's terrible. But I'm gonna say that, and my Chinese friends will probably say this is not good. But I think our interest is to create peace and stability across that region, and to build more, maximize the amount of student exchanges so we can build more mutual understanding within the region. And that's actually really hard, really, really hard. And lastly, I think we should never say that there's a sinocentric sphere. Korea is a very distinct society. Japan is a very distinct society. Malaysia is a very distinct society. And they, of course, inherited a lot of Chinese culture from the Tang Dynasty or the Ming Dynasty or the Song Dynasty, which is undeniable. But they also have a huge amount of indigenous culture, and they've localized things to create their own societies. So that kind of understanding of the plurality of the region is not the direction of the current Chinese government, which is really focused on creating it's homogenizing what it means to be Chinese. And some would call it Hanification. And if you read some of the reports of the Workers' Party, even the Uyghur community and minority communities are being Sinicized, so that they fit within the context of what the current, and I say this, current understanding of what China is. Because Mao, once he ended the Civil War, he talked about China of different nationalities, and created special programs to recognize all the different all the different ethnicities that existed in China. But today, it's Hanification of all the different identities, or Sinification, that's defined by the party, and more, as Kevin Rudd writes in his book on China, Xi Jinping's thought on basically how Xi and the party understand how China should evolve moving forward.
So what I found so striking about your the discourse you use, I almost felt, I got a sense you have really anonymously surveyed a lot of foreign policymakers and diplomats in Southeast Asia, because I almost felt like you're kind of channeling a lot of their vocabulary, which is so different than a lot of the words we use in the Atlantic, European and U.S. kind of frame of like friends and enemies and axis and allies and sometimes frenemies. And I'm wondering how you think about this in terms of the importance of stability in Southeast Asia, because it sounds to me like there's almost a lot of these overlapping kind of strategic cooperative ventures, almost like, yeah, in a layered way. And I have a sense from the words you use that there's a real emphasis on pragmatism, cooperation, stability. And it's interesting to think about what's happening in the U.S. now with European, Canadian, U.S. relations and the United Nations in terms of how things are shifting, in terms of how we think about allies and enemies and so forth. So I'm curious where your thoughts are, if that kind of how that preference for kind of economic stability, avoiding a war between China and Taiwan, will play out in terms of, you know, the diplomatic moves that we see Southeast Asia playing, and if they'll be robust against this kind of zero-sum types of conflict that can endanger economic commerce and exchange and stability.
So yeah, maybe I did borrow a lot of or channeled the ideas, but I guess it's from my experience talking with so many and watching the dynamics over 27 years. I'm still an amateur, but I guess that's how I see the region evolving. Remember that most of these countries were colonial countries, so their priority is to build their national identity. And you know, some of it's rebuilding, as Benedict Anderson writes, imagined community. I mean, in the past there was really no Malaysia or Indonesia, right? They were the Bugis kingdom, but they built a modern identity on something. So I think that, you know, they are very protective of their new sought-after sovereignty, and they want to build a national identity that is sovereign and that they can avoid national interference and continue to develop. So they have made that decision that the best way to do it is through these schemes like ASEAN centrality. I think there's also the reality that if the region is so integrated that they can't really choose between China and the United States. They really benefit from that relationship. But there is some complicated aspects of the relationship. But the countries say, listen, you know, we want to be sovereign, we want to move forward. Why deal with this now? Let's, you know, wait 10 years, 20 years, and hopefully that we'll have more mature leaders. And, you know, that's what happened with Japan and China over some territories. They basically said, well, you know, when they normalize relations, let's let future generations deal with this. You know, it lasted 20 years, 25 years, and now, you know, they're finding ways to work through it. So it's a pragmatism and understanding what are their core interests, and their core interest is mutual economic development, stability. And if they decide to have a zero-sum approach, they will ultimately, this will not be productive for building their national identities and building their societies after colonialism. And this goes back to the Taiwan question. Well, I don't think conflict is zero across the Taiwan Straits. I think that the Chinese Communist Party has invested the past 70, 80 years in building schools and roads and bridges and universities because it wants to rebuild its society after colonialism and after its own problems in society, right? We can blame the 100 years of we can blame European powers for toppling China, but to be frank, they had many problems in the Qing dynasty before that. And they would have gone one way or the other. So I think, again, it's important for us to think about the historical experiences of these countries through the lens of imperialism and their own instabilities to understand their priorities about economic growth, development, and finding ways to be pragmatic about issues. And I still think that is the pattern of behavior they're going to continue to use. And only in the most extreme cases will they deviate from that. That would be my analysis. And I think, China's views on using gray zone tactics to shift the boundaries is a good example. They don't want to use hard power. They want to find other ways to achieve their interests. And that takes time and patience and a different mindset. Hope that's helpful.
Hi. So I go to university in the United States, and so because of that, I've know a lot of Taiwanese nationals, and I've talked to them about the Taiwan question. And something that I've heard is that while they think about it, it's on the back of their mind. They're not too concerned because were China to invade, the war that would precipitate would destroy any technological advantage they would acquire as a result of the destruction of Taiwanese infrastructure and technology. So I have two questions. One, how does that kind of concern, the concern of war destroying the current advantage that Taiwan has in terms of technology? And then two, were China to invade Taiwan or that conflict were to break out, what would that mean for ASEAN centrality?
So let's assume there's a conflict, but I think the conflict between Taiwan and China can emerge in many different scenarios. It could be a blockade, it could be actual conflict, it could be a massive disinformation attack and cutting submarine cables. There's a lot of different aspects. I do think that we're already seeing the diversification of semiconductor supply chains away from Taiwan. And there's a couple different ways they're doing that. They're cooperating with the Japanese and the Americans and the Dutch to relocate some of the supplies. The Japanese have created something called Rapidus, which is their own next generation semiconductor plant, and they're hoping to surpass TMC. And America now, if you've followed it, it sounds like a Austin Powers movie, getting gazillions of dollars from everybody. Watch the show, you'll get it. But they're investing in those technologies in the U.S. as well. So I think Taiwan needs to be careful about how important its semiconductor supply chains are, and how they need to use this as leverage to maintain their position. If China was to attack, my assumption is that they would get all the equipment and all the engineers would run away, and the management. And that's the real people that make these things. And even if you talk to the CEO of TMC, they say, listen, we're just the chef. We get wafers from the Japanese. We have the wafer carving devices from the Dutch. We have this from somebody else. We have this from somebody else. So actually, China has to reproduce all of that to get the technology. So I think that it's rather, I think it's a bit of a lost cause, but anything is possible. If there's a conflict, what happens to ASEAN centrality? I believe ASEAN centrality will continue. ASEAN will say, we don't have any other choice, and they'll hug each other tighter. And again, they'll try to form stronger partnerships with extra-regional partners like Japan, like Australia, like the EU, and continue to reach out as much as possible. That is, I think, in ASEAN's DNA, and I think that will continue to be the basic way it engages in diplomacy as long as it can.
Do we have more questions? Okay, seems not. Okay. Oh.
Please introduce yourselves.
My name is Mona Zaki. I come from Egypt. My field is strategic thinking and international marketing. I'm a professor as well, but I'm also a novelist writer. So my question is, thank you very much. You mentioned a very important word. China is not going into hard power, which is very relaxing, and it makes us feel really better, because I believe China is more into the soft power, and it's invading the world through their soft power, started by its own people all over the world, Chinese people, and then Chinese products with very good competitive prices. But my question is, have you seen the hard power of China? It's really worrying, because the defense and all those hard power facilities and weapons and technologies and all this, I believe it's a threat. Yes, we're discussing it's a heterogeneous strategy, and it's not a homogeneous culture at all among all those countries. But China is so much integrated in those cultures through its soft power strategies, through all kinds of powers. So don't you feel, being Canadian of Hungarian origin, living in Japan, this triangle exposure, don't you think that the fear from China, put aside the US unpredictable, thank you for this word, US unpredictable strategies, but China became predictable when you see how strong it is on all levels, not just the hard power, the soft power, the smart power. So what is the threat here? Because I feel the other countries around them still fear this. So can you tell us more about this? Thank you.
So I travel a lot, and I was in Taiwan recently, and walking around the streets, I had some wonderful dim sum and Taiwanese food. There was nobody in Taiwan that I met that was panicking about China's invasion. In Malaysia, I don't know anybody that is panicking about Chinese invasion. Maybe like lining up too many Chinese coming to eat their favorite laksa, but that's about it. Indonesia the same, Korea the same, Japan the same. Crisis is somewhat normalized in East Asia. So, I was in Korea when the martial law declaration happened, and we still went out for beer and chicken. And the next day, I went to the airport, and I came back a week later and had a nice walk around and enjoy. And when Kim Jong-un launches missiles over Japan, people still go for barbecue and sushi. What I'm trying to say is that there's a very different understanding of crisis in the region. Growingly, though, I think that there's a couple things that have alarmed the region. So one is back in 2016, the Chinese built some artificial islands in the South China Sea, and they militarized them. And I think this went against the common understanding of Southeast Asian countries. It went against a commitment that Xi Jinping made to then President Obama that he wouldn't militarize the South China Sea. We see gray zone tactics being applied to the Philippines constantly. And the Chinese, if they used the warships, they could finish the Philippines tonight. But they don't. They use gray zone tactics. But it's very worrisome for the Philippines. It's overwhelming. Across the Taiwan Strait, every day there are Chinese fighters that go around Taiwan to test and to map the Taiwanese response to the Chinese. We see gray zone tactics in and around Japanese waters and into Japanese territories as well this past year or last year. So more and more I think there's a real sense that China is increasing its presence. Two, the COVID-19 pandemic I think fundamentally broke the trust of many countries in China because they weren't transparent. Of course, they did a great job in providing Sinovac vaccines to many countries in Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asian countries are happy. Any vaccine is better than no vaccine. But the transparency issue was really, really shocking. And then the drills around Taiwan have become much more concerning because, again, it has a cascade effect. if there is something that happens, it's not going to stay across the Taiwan Strait. And in this sense, I think this has become a growing concern for all the countries within the region. So I agree with you. They have enormous hard power, and that they have more power than all the countries in the region except for maybe Japan and the United States put together. And this is a concern. But I think there's growing awareness about this in the region. But at the same time, they have to figure out how to work with this neighbor, because it's their economic lifeline. And if there's a conflict, what happens to their development? So it's a very, very, very difficult relationship. On soft power, I just don't think soft power is so important. Ultimately, I love Chinese food. I went the other night with my partner. We had a great meal. We loved it. We spoke Chinese. We had fun. It was great. But that's not going to change my mindset on gray zone tactics or trade. What's going to change my mind is if the economic coercion happens against my country and they cut off big portions of my economy, like they did with the Australians after the request for a COVID-19 pandemic, or when the Lithuanians recognized the Taiwanese representative office as Taiwanese office. I can't remember. Something silly. That kind of action would changes my mind about Taiwan or China, not their food or movies. And actually, an interesting Hungarian student said to me the other day, there's not actually much Chinese influence in Europe. I mean, we like the food, but movies, not really. Like a few people like The Three Body Problem, which is a great science fiction series if you have a chance to watch it, but not that many watched it. Wolf Warrior movie series, it's kind of silly. Wandering Earth is another movie. It's not gained the kind of traction that we think it would, especially compared to smaller countries like South Korea or Japan. So I think be careful with the soft power dynamics, and again, look for what can really change the minds of people. And it will be punitive economic measures. It will be mismanagement of issues such as COVID. It will be other issues that I think are alarming for countries.
Hello. Actually, I believe that the economy is the other side of the politics. So, I will speak about the map which you showed. If we will speak about the plan of the route and the belt and the route, we will find the most important point is in the Middle East. And this area now, I can say that it's a very complicated situation, from Sudan to Egypt to Gaza to Israel to all these places, and Syria, Lebanon, all these places. So if we will believe that the belt and the route, the main point, one of the main points between Europe and China and all this Asian side will be this place. And also it's the biggest market for America, USA, and Europe, and Asia, for everything, the biggest market ever. This situation now, complicated situation, do you think it will affect any of these plans for America or China or all these places which are planning now to get this biggest power? Do you think it will affect or not?
So this is great. So thank you very much for the question. So historically, in the post-World War II period, it was the United States Navy that basically secured the sea lines of communication. If there was no U.S. in the post-World War period, energy would have been even more expensive. But it was the U.S. Navy that made sea lines of communication stable to allow for energy to move throughout the world. And we shouldn't underestimate this. And this is why I think when we think about conflict in sea lines, it's so worrisome. And what's been happening in the Red Sea since the conflict on October 7th, the Houthis have been launching missiles in the Red Sea. We have ships that have to go around the Horn of Africa now, it's increased shipping costs 175%. And, who pays for that? Us, right? This is really bad. And it's bad for every single economy except the energy exporters, which is good for them. So I think that this region, of course, is really important. And one of my concerns is if the United States does remove its protection of sea lines of communication, what does this mean for many countries? And I think that this is something we should be seriously concerned about. For the Japanese, they're actually pretty good. They've invested a lot in the Navy. They can help themselves. Chinese haven't. The Koreans haven't. Southeast Asian countries haven't. Even the Middle Eastern countries, are they going to be able to support the export for global growth? The United States doesn't, and North America doesn't need energy anymore. We are energy independent. We are net exporters. We don't need to waste our time in that part of the world. And this is a big concern. What will happen with the sea lanes of communication if they break down? And they can break down because of conflict. They can break down because of pirates. They can break down because of natural disasters. There's a lot of, and of course, climate change can also affect sea lines of communication. And I think this is a place for immense cooperation, but it's also a place where we could see a lot of challenges emerge if the United States does withdraw a lot of its support for sea lines of communication. The U.S. also is a global public good. It's not perfect, as we all know, but it does a lot of things that we don't really recognize to keep our global economy working and maintain our prosperity. So you've picked up a really good point. And China is very concerned about this. When 40 years ago, 50 years ago, it was energy independent. But 50 years ago, it wasn't a global superpower. It wasn't the global production network. It wasn't the second largest economy. But today, it must be connected to energy, consumers, resources. And if those sea lanes of communication break down, the second biggest engine of economic growth on the planet will also break down. And this has serious complications for every single economy on the planet. Great question.
Hi, I didn't introduce myself earlier, but it's Caleb. And I wanted to ask about that big, beautiful chart you had about the different opinions of the citizens of the different countries with respect to Chinese and American leadership. What are the factors that you think that go into shaping those views? Is it ethnic factors, historical factors, colonization, trade, whether they trade more with the U.S., China, who they receive their investment from? Kind of what do you think is causing the distribution of those views across those countries?
A lot of things. The historical experience with colonial powers, their whole historical experience with China. There's not one reason, but let's look at the Vietnam. So Vietnam believes that they were a colony of China for 1,000 years. That's what they believe. Okay, I'm not going to do a history lesson, but that's what they believe. And they also have territorial disputes, and the Chinese invaded Vietnam in 1979. So they have a lot of bitter points. So their views about China are a little bit more pessimistic. The Filipinos, they have problems with China today because of territorial issues, economic investment. So they have a higher degree of concern about China. Malaysia, though, as I said, strong economic relations. Their government has been generally less positive towards the United States and the kind of economy that the United States promotes. Singapore is infamously neutral. Laos and Cambodia are not so integrated into the global economy, but more integrated into the Chinese economy, so that's why they have more positive views. So I think there's a lot of different factors, and I think you should talk to some of the Southeast Asian diplomats to get a better sense, but I think they'd echo what I said.
Do we have more questions? Okay, it seems we're done. Okay, well, thank you for your questions and thank you for the lecture.
Thank you so much.